No one had ever seen someone so happy to go to jail as this woman. But her joy was understandable. This wasn't your typical prison. Inmates here only needed to lie around and eat, and they'd earn a reward. The longer they stayed, the richer they became. Every minute spent lounging, even just staring blankly and composing poetry in their heads, earned them 340,000 won. There was a catch, though. Prices inside were 100 times higher than outside. On her first day, the young widow spent 200 million won on a bed and a toilet. Still, with her ever-increasing balance, she could freely indulge in kimchi and live a luxurious life she'd never dreamed of. Of course, she wasn't the only one in this peculiar prison. Shortly after, a young man entered. His cell earned him only 30,000 won per minute, totaling over 40 million won a day. Still, it beat working himself to the bone on the outside, only to sometimes be cheated out of his wages. However, a problem quickly arose. The young man needed to use the restroom, but prison rules forbade leaving one's cell at night. Breaking the rules meant forfeiting half his earnings. He'd initially planned to buy a blanket, but even a cheap, chicken hand blanket cost an exorbitant 71.1 million won. The young man couldn't believe his eyes and wanted to cancel the transaction immediately. He figured enduring the cold was better than wasting his money. Reviewing the rules, he confirmed that prices were indeed 100 times higher. But this didn't faze the hardworking young man. If he couldn't earn much, he could at least save, right? Unable to afford the blanket, he bought a pound of old newspapers and some leftover takeout containers. That only cost him 4 minutes worth of earnings. Thinking about waking up to over 10 million won, he suddenly felt a desperate urge to pee. He was about to burst. He yelled, urgently needing an empty bottle. While a plastic bottle cost a small fortune, he was desperate. It was a night of painful spending. But come morning, his balance had increased by over 714 million won. The young man finally understood. This was the legendary time is money in action. Full of energy, he stepped out of his cell and discovered 7 other inmates, each with their own room. His cell was on the 3rd floor. For easier communication, they decided to refer to each other by their floor number. A countdown timer in the main hall displayed their remaining prison time. It wasn't individual timers, but one shared clock. They had to work together. When the timer reached 0, they'd be released and receive their earnings. Below the timer were a phone and a delivery slot for ordering anything they desired. 6th floor walked over and bought a pack of cigarettes and a lighter. The timer decreased by 2 minutes. Doing the math, 1 minute equated to roughly 250,000 won in purchasing power, far more than most of their per-minute earnings. But they'd figure out the consequences when the timer hit 0. So, they gathered to discuss their spending strategy. However, everyone had different ideas, making it difficult to agree. By lunchtime, their stomachs rumbling, they still hadn't reached a consensus. Then, they discovered a serious problem. They couldn't buy any food or drinks. 8th floor looked puzzled. The previous night, she'd received 12 free meals. Assuming they were all for her, she sampled a bit of each and threw the rest away, even using the bottled water to bathe. 3rd floor was furious. What good is a pretty face with no brains? It turned out she'd eaten everything herself, leaving the lower floors to starve. 8th floor was the epitome of selfishness. While she argued she wasn't fond of boxed meals and only ate once a day, her actions angered the others. However, anger wouldn't solve anything. They decided to let it slide this time. Understanding the situation, 8th floor promised to keep only one portion and share the rest from now on. But a new problem emerged. The 12 meals were delivered via a conveyor belt from top to bottom. If someone on a higher floor took more, those below would go hungry. They temporarily set aside the food issue and went to tour 8th floor's room. They were stunned by what they saw. Compared to the lower floor's washroom-sized cells, hers was a presidential suite. Though none of them had likely seen a presidential suite, they were even more envious of her earnings. It dawned on them. The higher the floor, the higher the income. 8th floor, at the top, not only controlled the food supply, but also earned 340,000 won per minute, the highest rate among them. 7th floor earned 210,000 won per minute. The lower the floor, the smaller the room and the lower the pay. 1st floor, at the bottom, earned a meager 10,000 won. It was a microcosm of society, a clear class divide. with their positions seemingly assigned at random. One thing remained constant: the higher classes could crush the lower ones at any moment. Suddenly, they noticed the countdown timer showed only 15 minutes remaining. 8th floor had used their shared time to buy herself a mountain of clothes, trying them on leisurely, much to the other floor's annoyance. She'd used their collective time for frivolous purchases. 2nd floor, enraged, snapped, "If you want to play dress up, do it in your own room." But 8th floor explained the rules forbade taking items out of the rooms, and she wanted to show off her new wardrobe. She was incorrigible. Time was running out, meaning the game was about to end. Ironically, 8th floor, the source of their problems, discovered a way to increase their time, climbing the stairs. The longer and the more people who climbed, the more time they'd gain. It sounded absurd, but they had no time to question it. 1st floor, desperate, was the first to start climbing. The others followed, but the timer didn't budge, even after they were all exhausted. Time ran out. Despair set in. Was their dream over? It couldn't end like this. Just then, the timer reset to 24 hours, and everyone erupted in cheers. 8th floor, smugly, took all the credit. But the others no longer resented her. It was a perfect redemption. Thanks to 8th floor's discovery, everyone woke up early the next day, stretched, and began climbing, hoping to earn more time, and therefore, more money. They climbed from dawn till dusk, relentlessly. They told themselves that if they persevered for 2.5 years, they could buy all of South Korea upon release. But a few days later, a new problem arose: food shortages. One meal a day wasn't enough to sustain their strenuous climbing. So, they established a rationing system. The working group received 2 meal boxes. The resting group received 1. This evenly distributed the 12 boxes, but another issue quickly surfaced. 1st floor, due to joint problems, fell while climbing. He just wanted to rest for a moment, but 6th floor had suddenly become the overseer. Her friendly smile didn't stop her from forcing him back to work, muttering about how he was costing them precious time. 6th floor's bossy behavior angered everyone, but only 2nd floor dared to confront her. He told 1st floor to rest, offering to take his place. In the following days, 3rd floor also helped out, but 1st floor knew this wasn't sustainable. So, he offered to become the janitor, responsible for cleaning everyone's waste. He traded his living space for daily food. Things settled into a routine. However, just as they thought they were on the path to riches, a new problem emerged. Over time, all 8 floors realized the system of trading labor for wealth was collapsing. The time they gained from climbing was diminishing. The next day, they woke up with only 30 minutes left. Panic ensued, everyone transforming into frantic stair climbing machines. Suddenly, the resident of the 4th floor had a seizure, foaming at the mouth. Everyone carried her down to the lobby, intending to buy medicine. Unexpectedly, the 6th floor resident tried to stop them. He argued it was just a seizure, not a reason to cash out, and at worst, it would only result in brain damage. Buying medicine, however, would cost a lot of money. He truly seemed heartless. Yet, from a certain perspective, he wasn't entirely wrong. However, their pent-up frustration and anger finally erupted. Seeing the 2nd and 6th floor residents brawling, the 3rd floor resident seized the opportunity to buy the medicine. But the 6th floor resident chased him down and knocked him to the ground. At this point, the others couldn't just stand by and watch. They jumped in and pulled the 6th floor resident off. The 3rd floor resident finally managed to buy the medicine. Just then, the 8th floor resident suddenly burst out laughing, drawing everyone's attention. Following her gaze, they looked at the timer. The number 40 hours displayed shocked everyone. How interesting. Just a small fight, and their time had increased significantly. This meant climbing stairs wasn't the only way to extend their time. Looking around the lobby, there were no security cameras, no hidden corners. The 7th floor resident quickly formed a bold hypothesis. Could it be that they had all become entertainment for someone? The audience had grown tired of watching them climb stairs, so now they needed a more exciting show. This thought felt somewhat degrading, but to gain more time, what did a little humiliation matter? The next day, to test his theory, the 7th floor resident immediately performed his special talent. Sure enough, their time increased by another 20 hours. Seeing this, the others also showed off their skills. The 5th floor resident sang a song, earning 10 hours. The 6th floor resident broke bricks with his bare hands, earning 15 hours. The 2nd floor resident performed a skit combined with brick breaking, earning 17 hours. The 4th floor resident, by somehow torturing the audience, earned an hour and a half. The 3rd floor resident literally acted like a fool, ultimately earning 18 minutes. After his performance, he urged the 1st floor resident to start, thinking to himself, what talent could a disabled person possibly have? Unexpectedly, the 1st floor resident turned out to be a master performer. With a spectacular clown act, he earned 30 hours. They had accumulated an astonishing 100 hours. Now, only the 8th floor resident remained. Everyone was curious about her abilities, but she simply propositioned the 7th floor resident. "Want to go upstairs with me?" The 7th floor resident, somewhat clueless, asked what she meant. The 8th floor resident simply winked. "You know what I mean." Indeed, everyone understood except for him. But the 8th floor resident's blatant flirting annoyed the others. She was convinced she was good at it and would definitely be rewarded with a lot of time. However, after asking around, no one agreed to go upstairs with her, finding the request a bit much. Finally, only the 6th floor resident said he might reluctantly give it a try. So, the two of them ran upstairs. The unseen audience seemed to thoroughly enjoy this passionate performance, immediately rewarding them with 69 hours without hesitation. Everyone was shocked. Just teaching each other the alphabet earned them that much. They should have done this sooner. At this point, a thought occurred to them: earning money without spending it was meaningless. After all, the purpose of making money was to enjoy it. So, they began discussing when to end the game. Since the 1st floor resident had the least earnings, they let him decide. He humbly aimed for 1 billion won. How modest! But at the current rate, he was earning 14.4 million won per day. It would take him 2.5 months to reach his goal. Everyone happily agreed. Anyway, they could earn even more. The 1st floor aimed for 1 billion. The 2nd, 2 billion. The 3rd, 3 billion. The 4th, 5 billion. The 5th, 8 billion. The 6th, 13 billion. The 7th, 21 billion. The 8th floor could potentially earn 34 billion. At this point, a new problem arose. Previously, the 1st floor resident, due to his disability, had been responsible for cleaning up everyone's trash. But now, having topped the performance rankings, he naturally didn't want to be the janitor anymore. Everyone agreed this was reasonable, so they proposed a secret ballot to choose a new cleaner. This, too, could be considered a performance. Because the 8th floor had the largest room, and the 3rd floor had contributed the least time, these two became the prime targets. Due to the 5th floor abstaining, the vote initially resulted in a tie. Ultimately, the 8th floor resident was elected, leaving her utterly speechless. The 6th floor resident, in disbelief, personally verified the results. But the truth was that, driven by resentment towards the wealthy, there was no self-interest involved. Moreover, the 8th floor resident's previous actions had alienated everyone, except, of course, the 6th floor resident. Thus, the 8th floor's room was successfully transformed into a restroom. This earned them an additional 24 hours. Everyone thought the matter was settled, but the 8th floor resident refused to hand over her room key, seemingly going back on her word. They tried to reason with her. Everyone understood that for someone like her, serving others would be humiliating. But they were all in the same boat and needed to be understanding. Faced with their persuasion, the 8th floor resident responded with disdain. "Same boat, please." With that, she sashayed back to her room. Initially, they thought she was just having trouble accepting reality, but they were quickly hit with a cold dose of it. That evening, at dinner time, the conveyor belt delivered only empty food containers. They suddenly remembered their food was distributed by the top floor, and the top floor was the 8th. This meant that if the 8th floor didn't provide food, they wouldn't even have the right to exist. In other words, the 8th floor resident held the ultimate trump card. She could do absolutely nothing, just dole out a small amount of food that wasn't even hers, and live like a queen, reaping the greatest benefits. 3 days passed in a flash. Everyone was reaching their physical limits. But the outside audience seemed to be enjoying it immensely. The time didn't decrease, it actually increased. If that's how it is, let's just overthrow everything. No one gets peace. The second floor resident stood up, intending to use up all their time to end the game. Unexpectedly, the first floor resident clung to his leg, pleading, "I can't leave like this before earning my 1 billion won. Even if I die here, I can't let the time end this way." Seeing the first floor resident's desperate pleas, the third floor resident seemed to recall his own days of toiling to pay off debts. He volunteered to become the new cleaner, taking all the waste into his own room. To persuade everyone to let him clean, he even enthusiastically declared, "My performance was the worst, so this is only natural." His grand, passionate words were actually just a ploy to earn more money. The fourth floor resident, second from the bottom, couldn't bear it any longer and offered to share the burden with the third. So there it was. They didn't actually care for each other, but they were willing to do anything for food, even turn themselves into professional actors. Without a script, without lines, crocodile tears flowed freely. After a series of heartfelt apologies, the eighth floor resident finally opened her door. It turned out she hadn't been paying attention to them at all, happily amusing herself in her room. But in response to their apologies and pleas, she presented another condition. "From now on, I have full access to the communal funds. I can buy as many clothes as I want." The fourth and sixth floor residents quickly became her lackeys. Everything was settled. So, that night, everyone finally got the food they craved. But the price? Everyone became servants to the eighth floor, forced to participate in the king game proposed by her. The person who draws the king ball gets to randomly draw 2 other balls and has the power to order the people with the corresponding numbers on the balls to do anything. At first, everyone took it lightly as the commands were minor, like holding hands or kissing. However, the time earned from these small acts was minimal, so the game quickly escalated. When the person on the 8th floor drew the king ball, she ordered the people on the 6th and 2nd floors to fight. Initially, the 6th floor looked down on the 2nd. Unexpectedly, the 2nd floor resident was a professional athlete and, within a few moves, had beaten the 6th floor resident to a pulp. Unfortunately, the 2nd floor resident had injured their hand a few days prior while breaking bricks. The 6th floor resident seized this weakness, targeting the injury relentlessly. He pressed his advantage, brutally attacking the 2nd floor resident, demanding their surrender with every blow. But the tenacity of a martial artist wouldn't allow the 2nd floor resident to give in. Meanwhile, everyone else, worried about the 2nd floor resident, pleaded with the 6th floor to stop. But as long as the 2nd floor resident refused to yield, the beating continued. Only when severely battered and bruised did the 2nd floor resident finally concede. This bloody spectacle earned them 50 more hours. The 2nd floor resident was badly injured. But the 8th floor resident's game wouldn't end just because of an injury. As long as she was on the 8th floor, she held the power to control everyone. Seeing the 2nd floor resident's condition, everyone understood that if this continued, someone could die. One of the 8th floor resident's lackeys, the 4th floor resident, came up with a brilliant idea, using a stun gun as the ultimate enforcer. If anyone refused the king's command to avoid being beaten, they would receive an electric shock. Surely, this would be entertaining. Better this than watching people beat each other to a pulp. That was terrifying. The idea wasn't bad and was quickly approved by everyone. The next day, the game resumed. The 8th floor resident, once again, luckily drew the king ball. This time, she ordered the 3rd floor resident to reach inside the 5th floor resident's shirt. Everyone still had to abide by the rules. This humiliated the 3rd floor resident. Despite a hidden desire to comply, he couldn't overcome his moral compass. Ultimately, he chose the electric shock. He might get hurt, so it was best to stay still during the shock. Nobody wanted to witness this, but compared to being pummeled by the 6th floor resident, this was probably more bearable. The stun gun knocked the 3rd floor resident to the ground, alarming everyone. Unexpectedly, a warm, pale yellow liquid began flowing upwards onto his face. As his face made contact with the warm, yellow fluid, his self-respect was utterly shattered. He retreated to a corner, dismissing the apologetic 5th floor resident. From this moment of utter humiliation, he made a resolution. Next time, he would resolutely obey every command of the king. The following day, the 4th floor resident drew the king ball. But this time, she introduced a new twist, a coin toss to decide the winner. The loser would still receive the electric shock. The ill-fated pair from the 2nd and 6th floors clashed once more. The outcome was predictable. With a single shock, the 2nd floor resident collapsed face first onto the floor. The warm, pale yellow liquid flowed again. The 5th floor resident, with practiced efficiency, cleaned it up with a mop. On the 3rd day of the game, the 8th floor resident miraculously drew the king ball again. This time, the participants were the 2nd and 3rd floor residents. By now, the pattern was clear. The 8th floor resident ordered them to slap each other until one gave up. The loser would still receive the electric shock. Everyone complied, knowing this game was a breeding ground for anger and resentment. It was the easiest way to divide them from within. Furthermore, the longer it went on, the deeper the hatred grew. By the 2nd slap, the 3rd floor resident couldn't take it anymore and surrendered. The 3rd floor resident received another electric shock. Double the pain, double the humiliation. As usual, the 3rd floor resident locked himself in the corner, stewing in his pain and shame. Just then, he heard a knock. Initially, he thought it was the 2nd floor resident coming to apologize, but instead, he learned from the 1st floor resident the truth about the rigged king game. For several consecutive days, the upper floors had been the king, and the lower floors had been punished. The 1st floor resident had long suspected something was amiss, and the coin toss game confirmed his suspicions. Having been a circus clown, he recognized the 4th floor resident's sleight of hand. No matter which side the 2nd floor resident called, she was destined to lose. The 3 of them quickly sought out the 7th floor resident, the intelligent and kind one. However, they had no concrete proof, and he didn't want to be the one to take the lead. He offered a few words of comfort and let them leave, but then secretly followed them. Sure enough, he caught the 4th floor resident in the act. He asked what she was doing. The 4th floor resident didn't hide it. After all, they were both upper floor residents, part of the same class. Sharing this little trick with the 7th floor wouldn't hurt. It's acetone, the 4th floor resident explained. Ping-pong balls are made of celluloid, which reacts with acetone. It makes them a little sticky, but it guarantees the desired outcome. This was how the 4th floor resident ensured she chose the king. The 7th floor resident was shocked. He revealed that the lower floors had discovered the scheme and wouldn't let it go. If the 4th floor resident didn't want to be isolated and eliminated, she'd better stop cheating. Let the game be fair. Otherwise, the consequences will be dire. The 4th floor resident was intimidated, showing signs of fear. But what would she do? The game indeed took a turn the next day. For the first time, the 1st floor resident drew the king ball. He chose the 7th and 8th floor residents to participate, demanding that the 4th floor resident use the back of her hand to catch the coin to prevent cheating. The person who guessed wrong would receive the electric shock. Unfortunately, this time the loser was the 8th floor resident. The 8th floor resident appeared bored, openly declaring the game no longer fun. Of course, it was fun when she won, but boring when she lost. Regardless, she couldn't back down. She had to accept the consequences. Everyone demanded she respect the rules. Seeing the 8th floor resident, the mastermind, finally brought to her knees, the lower floor residents felt an indescribable surge of excitement. They envisioned her fall from grace. This was fantastic. But it wasn't the best part. It turned out the seemingly superior 8th floor resident, when shocked, also wet herself like everyone else. This filled the lower floor residents with glee. But they soon realized it was all an illusion. Reality didn't unfold as expected. The 8th floor resident wasn't punished. She remained in control. When the 7th floor resident awoke, he found himself in the top floor penthouse. The entire game had changed. The 8th and 6th floor residents dropped the pretense. They believed they were natural rulers, entitled to more power and benefits. The game's ultimate goal was for the upper floors to control the lower floors. Only then would it be truly entertaining, yielding more time and rewards. Moreover, with the substantial rewards, the 4 lower floor residents would surely be grateful. Seeing the stun gun in the 6th floor resident's hand, the 7th floor resident understood everything. He had locked the phone in the lobby to prevent the lower floors from using up all the time and overthrowing them. Then, he smashed the phones in their rooms to prevent them from buying weapons to fight back. With the upper floors revealing their intentions, the game's rules became even more brutal. A life-or-death struggle emerged between the two classes, the rulers and the ruled. It was no different from the outside world. The downtrodden were always kept at the bottom, even if they struggled, using all their might to resist. Would the outcome be any different? When everyone reconvened, the 7th floor had fully established its dominance over the lower floors. He, as the spokesperson for the upper floors, floors 7 and 8, relayed the new rules of the game to the lower floors, floors 1, 2, 3, and 5. They now had 160 minutes of remaining time in the hall. The 4 people on the lower floors were tasked with earning 24 hours each day to maintain this time. Refusal meant no food. If the lower floor residents earned time through the game, they would be rewarded with coins. Both water and boxed meals cost 1 coin. They could purchase items through a delivery slot in the hall, but this also required coins. 1 coin was equivalent to 3 hours earned. In other words, for every 3 hours they earned, they received 1 coin. The lower floor residents erupted in outrage. Are those upper floor bastards insane? How could they come up with such twisted rules? The lower floors had the right to refuse, of course, but that meant starvation at the hands of the 8th floor. Thus, floors 4, 6, 7, and 8 became the overseers, while floors 1, 2, 3, and 5 became the time-earning slaves. Every day, they had to exchange their time for coins to obtain basic necessities. Each person had to earn 6 hours daily. Failure to meet the quota meant no food. This naturally sparked resistance. However, after a painful initial defeat, the 4 on the lower floors dared not rebel openly again. But no resistance didn't mean an end to their suffering. Only true slaves could be exploited to their fullest potential. Today's game was called Eagle Catches the Chicks. The 4 lower floor residents had to choose a body part to be bound. Then, the upper floor residents, armed and playing the role of eagles, would begin their attack. The 1st floor resident, already disabled with bound hands, naturally became the first target. Next was the 5th floor resident, whose legs were tied. Even though she was a woman, they showed no mercy. Then it was the 2nd floor resident's turn. Blindfolded, startled, she instinctively lashed out with a punch, which enraged the 6th floor resident. After a brutal beating, she was luckily saved by the 7th floor resident's intervention. Otherwise, the 2nd floor resident would have likely earned a one-way ticket out of this prison. Only the 3rd floor resident, by hiding in the shadows, managed to avoid detection and was spared. Therefore, he was exempt from punishment. However, this same 3rd floor resident became the tormentor in the game's final stage. He stood in the middle, blindfolded, holding a bat. The other 3 had their heads wrapped in transparent tape. The 3rd floor resident then had to spin 10 times and swing the bat to choose the final victim. As expected, bad luck always seemed to find the downtrodden. The unfortunate 1st floor resident was beaten unconscious. This game earned them 26 hours, totaling 9 coins. But even at payday, the 7th floor resident wouldn't let them rest. The rule was that each person could write down the number of coins they wanted, but they couldn't discuss it with each other. If the total exceeded 9, they would receive no payment for the day. This was the prisoner's dilemma. This way, the downtrodden would suspect and resent each other, diverting the conflict within their own class. After racking his brain, the 3rd floor resident figured they might each write down 3 coins, but he needed to survive, so he changed his 3 to a 1. The outcome was unfortunate. Everyone else wrote down 2. The 3rd floor resident's single coin bought him only a bottle of water. He'd almost given up, but seeing the potential rewards in the room, he forced himself to continue playing. This time, it was the 2nd floor resident's turn to be the tormentor. She spun around and swung the bat, selecting the next victim. The game continued in this manner. The fates of the 2 classes remained unchanged. In the end, the lower floor residents were beaten black and blue, while the upper floor residents reveled in their exploitation. Meanwhile, the unseen audience delighted in these prison survival dramas. For those on the lower floors, once accustomed to being victims, they would eventually fully accept it. Conversely, those on the upper floors, living daily on the sweat, tears, and even blood of others, would begin to believe their actions were justified. Thus, several days passed, and the 4 on the lower floors faced new difficulties. Exhausted from the constant torment, each desired an extra coin, resulting in a total exceeding 9. That day, everyone went hungry. They finally realized that continuing like this offered no hope. Unable to resort to violence, they decided on a silent protest, a strike. Even faced with the 6th floor residents' furious roars, the 4 remained motionless. However, this unity was quickly shattered by the 7th floor resident. He produced a single coin, promising it to whoever returned to their room first. Hesitation rippled through the group. Seeing this, the 1st and 2nd floor residents spoke up, attempting to bolster their resolve. This implied the incentive wasn't enticing enough. The 6th floor resident immediately raised the offer to 10 coins, threatening violence if they didn't comply within a minute. The 5th floor resident finally broke. Given a minute, she didn't even last 10 seconds, claiming a diabetic condition and inability to fast with the others. The lower floor's efforts crumbled. They suffered another defeat, and defeat meant further oppression. The 3rd floor resident couldn't endure any longer. He wanted to use his phone to purchase something for suicide, but the 6th floor resident had long since destroyed it. He considered smashing his head against the wall but flinched from the pain, resigning himself to a cowardly existence. But everything changed the next morning. He pulled a piece of paper from his backside. The 1st floor resident had secretly distributed it the previous night. He was planning a revolution, instructing everyone to enter his room via the delivery slot in the morning. If fighting individually failed, they would unite and take down their oppressors one by one. The 1st floor resident feigned a stomach ache, his cries luring the upper floor residents into his room. Perhaps weakened by days of enforced hunger, the 3 fought with all their might, but still couldn't subdue the 6th floor resident. He knocked them down and raised a taser. The revolution seemed doomed, but then, a sudden turn of events. The 1st floor resident's hands were healed, enabling him to join forces with the others and overpower the 6th floor resident. The 6th floor resident was brutally beaten. Dawn had finally arrived. The downtrodden had risen up, binding their oppressors. Finally, they could unleash their pent-up rage. The 1st floor resident gave the 6th floor resident a merciless beating. However, when it came to the 8th floor resident, they hesitated. She was, after all, a woman. Their successful revolution had been partly due to the 7th floor resident's assistance, so they released him, considering him an ally. After this dramatic turn, their remaining time increased by 48 hours. Apparently, the unseen audience was entertained. They then locked the 3 upper floor residents in their respective rooms, deciding to feed them daily until the game's end. They discovered that the water they toiled daily to earn was nothing more than bathwater for their former captors. Now, the 8th floor residents' possessions became common property. For the first time, they ate their fill, realizing the harmonious society they had dreamed of. Satiated, they naturally desired some enjoyment, specifically alcohol. While the room offered no such beverages, this didn't deter the resourceful group. The alcohol recipe required 100 million grams of something. While they could purchase it directly, they politely asked the 8th floor resident if they could use her funds. The 8th floor resident, predictably cunning, was unwilling to give anything away freely. She agreed, but only if they released her. The truth was, the 8th floor resident disliked being tied up. She preferred tying up others. Faced with her blunt proposition, they responded with an equally clear and decisive word, no. It seemed her opinion didn't matter much. Everyone quickly bought the recipe. After some collaboration, they finally crafted their first glass of soju. What's more, it tasted pretty good. So, they spent the entire day making and drinking. By evening, everyone was completely drunk. Gathered around the fire, they began talking about life and their ideals. Then, the 1st floor resident suggested, shouldn't we end this happy day with a delicious bowl of Korean ramen? After all that eating and drinking, embracing the full spirit of national pride, it would be a shame not to try. But while they could make alcohol, ramen was out of the question. It was practically impossible to acquire any of the necessary ingredients. So, the 1st floor resident put on a captivating performance of air eating. Everyone watched, mesmerized, and began to imitate him, as if they were truly enjoying a delicious bowl of ramen. In this moment, the thought of ending the game began to creep into their minds. Unexpectedly, the 1st floor resident suddenly objected. He hadn't earned his billion goo yet. Upon hearing this, the second-floor resident promised that, once they were out, they could all chip in to help him reach his goal. The others nodded in agreement. A consensus had been reached. With a little over 100 hours left, they began to enjoy their final moments of leisure. The 3 residents on the upper floors agreed with their decision, though it seemed they didn't really have much say in the matter. Everyone fed and cared for them daily, even going so far as to change their diapers. Time ticked by, and in the blink of an eye, the final night arrived. That evening, they all said their goodbyes. However, from the beginning, they had forgotten that they weren't the only 8 people in this prison. This mysterious group wasn't happy about the game ending. Or perhaps, there was someone within their ranks who didn't want it to end, and naturally, they took action. On the final night, the countdown timer suddenly went dark. Then, abruptly, it jumped up to 45 hours. They hadn't even managed to gain 24 hours previously, despite climbing stairs and enduring electric shocks. This made absolutely no sense. Reluctantly, they went to check on the remaining 3 residents. They even stripped them naked to search for clues, but found nothing. Even more terrifying, the following day, the timer jumped again to 52 hours. Before they could unravel the mystery, another incident occurred. Everyone was horrified to find the 4th-floor resident's mouth bloody. It appeared several of her teeth had been pulled out. But by whom? It turned out this was the reason for the time increase. The 4th-floor resident's teeth had been stolen during the night after she was drugged, so she had no idea who the culprit was. That night, the 3rd-floor resident seemed to suddenly realize something. He frantically woke everyone up and rushed to the 6th-floor resident's room. When he removed the man's shoes, he discovered that his toenails had been cruelly ripped out. But even more surprising, why hadn't the 6th-floor resident said anything? It turned out he had suspected one of them was deliberately sabotaging the game. He had endured the pain in silence, hoping to catch the culprit red-handed. But who among them wouldn't want the game to end? Like the 4th-floor resident, he had been drugged and didn't know who was responsible. Suspicion began to fester among them. The first suspect was the 7th-floor resident. After all, he had helped the perpetrators before. Perhaps he had ulterior motives for helping them this time as well. The 5th and 3rd floor residents defended him, but the 2nd floor resident became suspicious of them. Seeing this, the 7th floor resident turned his accusations towards her, saying, "Those who are quick to accuse others are the dangerous ones, because they're trying to deflect suspicion from themselves." As they continued to speculate, they completely lost trust in one another. Resigned, the 2nd floor resident resorted to her last option, locking everyone in their rooms. This way, the saboteur wouldn't be able to cause any more trouble. She only trusted the 5th floor resident, who had maintained a saintly image throughout the least likely to harm anyone. So, she entrusted her with the care of the 3 residents on the upper floors. Unfortunately, saints are called saints because they're not just kind to the good, but also show compassion to villains disguised as victims. After some pathetic pleading, the 5th floor resident went to the 2nd floor resident, begging her to release the others. "They're all good people, it's just that things wouldn't have turned out this way if they hadn't come here. We don't have much time left, let's release them. It's almost over." However, the 2nd floor resident was firm and refused outright. At this moment, the 5th floor resident's mental state seemed to crumble. She started hallucinating, seeing the 4th and 8th floor residents telling her they had been released by the 2nd floor resident. But apparently, she was still angry with the 6th floor resident, as he was still tied up. Hearing this, the 5th floor resident's saintly heart swelled. She rushed to untie the 6th floor resident, asking if the 2nd floor resident had been there. Unexpectedly, the 6th floor resident seized the opportunity, burying his head in her chest and sobbing dramatically. The 5th floor resident, having never experienced anything like this, felt her mind reeling. Her compassion and love for all beings surged. She decided to untie him. A perfectly happy ending. Everyone's free, everyone can leave. What could be better? But in the next moment, the 5th floor resident realized that being kind to the wicked is cruel to oneself. The ideal was beautiful, but the reality was brutal. The batons and stun guns were back in the hands of the upper floor residents, and they regained control of the entire game. After a brief period of humiliation, these residents became even more tyrannical. In the end, everyone was beaten within an inch of their lives. Even the 5th floor resident, everyone's compassionate saint, was tied up. But that wasn't enough to appease the 6th floor resident. He decided to spend his time buying a revolver, determined to find the traitor and end it all with a single shot. He made everyone kneel in a line before him. The 4th floor resident stood beside him with a baseball bat, acting as his enforcer. After interrogating each person, they all denied being the culprit. Certain that someone was lying and unwilling to waste any more words, the 6th floor resident took out his gun and began playing Russian roulette with everyone. The 2nd floor resident was lucky and wasn't hit. But the 6th floor resident hated lucky people the most, so he immediately took the baseball bat and gave her a few extra whacks. Next was the 7th floor resident. His luck wasn't as good, and he was shot through the thigh. To prevent him from bleeding out, the 4th floor resident quickly tore off her clothes to make a bandage. Next was the 1st floor resident. Sadly, he only had one good leg left. The 1st floor resident desperately pleaded with the 6th floor resident not to touch his remaining leg. He needed it to make a living after getting out of prison. To the 1st floor resident's desperate pleas, the 6th floor resident simply told him, "Pray sincerely." And then he prepared to pull the trigger. But at that moment, the 3rd floor resident suddenly spoke up, saying he knew who the culprit was. Since each room had a surveillance camera, they could buy the recordings to find the culprit. Upon hearing this, the 8th floor resident immediately took the 6th floor resident to do just that. Surprisingly, it worked. The culprit was the 1st floor resident, the one who appeared the most harmless and easily bullied. Truly, you can know a person's face, but not their heart. The 1st floor, exposed, finally erupted. Initially, those on the upper floors worked the lower floors like pack animals to earn time. So why, upon gaining power, did they stop? Why not torment those above as they had been tormented? Why should only the lower floors suffer, while the upper floors, upon facing the same hardship, cried for the game to end? Clearly, the 1st floor wasn't resigned to this. He not only pulled out the 6th floor's toenails, but also blindfolded him and solicitously bathed him in a warm, yellow liquid. Seeing this on camera, the 6th floor erupted in fury. "He'll deal with that bastard. End this game." According to the original rules, if one person logs out, the game must end. Therefore, the 8th floor quickly intervened, stopping the 6th floor's impulsive act. His legs had been broken in a fall, robbing him of his ability to use violence. At this point, the 8th floor finally held absolute power. The program, with its constant twists and turns, delighted the audience. The time limit was increased to 150 hours. The 8th floor grew tired of earning time through exploitation, finding it insufficiently stimulating. She ordered everyone to return the 6th floor to his room. Then, she had everyone else tied up and locked in their rooms. The game, in her mind, was just beginning. The 8th floor took pleasure in purchasing recordings of their writhing agony, watching them day and night. As the ruler of the highest level, she had no other needs. Her sole purpose was to torture the lower floors for amusement. She needed something more stimulating. After all, they had toiled, fought tooth and nail, betrayed, extorted, and deceived. They had committed every evil imaginable just to survive and earn rewards in this prison. What could be more stimulating? The 8th floor grew bored with it all. The audience behind the screens also began to lose interest. So, she decided on a more cruel form of torture, a human experiment called sleep deprivation. She turned the 4th and 5th floors into her enforcers, ordering them to tie everyone else to chairs. They wrapped them in duct tape, used clips to pry their eyes open, ensuring they couldn't escape or close their eyes. Finally, they placed the victims' heads in narrow water tanks, continuously pouring water inside, forcing them to hold their breath. They were forced to stay awake for 24 hours straight. Minds began to collapse under the onslaught of sleep deprivation and hallucinatory visions. This experiment transcended the game's boundaries and served no practical purpose. It was merely a cruel amusement concocted by the 8th floor. Even medieval torture paled in comparison. Several days passed in this manner. The 4th and 5th floors fed them daily to maintain their bodily functions. Those who refused to eat were given glucose intravenously. Thus, they could neither live nor log out. By now, hallucinations had completely overtaken reason. After admiring the fruits of her game, the 8th floor suddenly had a new idea. She hurriedly bought a canvas and began to paint, vividly recreating the terrified faces of the lower floors. This terrified the 4th floor, but to avoid being tortured himself, he continued to flatter her. This delighted the 8th floor. So, she decided to find herself another companion, a dog. Isn't this dog beautiful? However, upon their first meeting, the dog promptly defecated on the 4th floor. How rude, but in the eyes of the 8th floor, the dog still held more grace than the 4th floor, so he dared not say a word. All he could do was force a smile. By day, flattering, by night, responsible for feeding the 8th floor's beloved dog. The 4th floor gradually grew resentful. She feared that one day, the 8th floor, in a fit of madness, would dispose of her, the very enforcer. Better to grab the money and run. Unexpectedly, she overheard a shocking secret from the 1st floor. The 1st floor claimed the 4th floor could switch rooms with the 8th. There was a way to swap positions. Once the 4th floor became the 8th, she could do whatever she pleased. It turned out that from the beginning, the 1st floor had never been content with his room. He had deliberately called to inquire about switching rooms, only to learn it would cost 1 billion won to ascend to the 8th floor. Recalling their previous conversation, everyone now understood why the 1st floor had been so determined to earn 1 billion won. It turned out he never intended to leave this prison, but rather to earn enough to climb to the 8th floor and become the ruler. He had disguised himself as a member of the lowest, most easily bullied class. Ultimately, it was all for the final goal, to become the ultimate power. The 1st floor's stories successfully swayed the 4th floor. Why couldn't she become the ruler of the 8th floor? So, she shared this information with the others, enticing them to join her, preparing for a second revolution. Every night, the 8th floor immersed herself in her artwork and maintained strict surveillance. Only during the day did she venture out for leisure and relaxation, making it the perfect opportunity to strike. After each golf session, she would take a bath. The 4th floor could seize this opportunity to steal her weapons, then have the 5th floor quietly untie everyone else. They would wait for her to emerge and then launch their final attack. The plan was meticulously crafted. The day of action arrived in a blink. The 4th floor continued her usual servitude to the 8th floor. The 5th floor seized the opportunity and began to act, freeing everyone from the bottom up. But even the most perfect plans can have unexpected variables. The dog seemed to have detected the 5th floor crawling up the stairs. It barked furiously below. Seeing this, the 4th floor tried to distract the 8th floor. But at this moment, another incident occurred. Due to prolonged torture, the 3rd floor's legs gave way, and he fell. The dog barked even louder, alerting the 8th floor that something was amiss. Anxious, the 4th floor hurriedly made excuses. Unexpectedly, the dog suddenly darted out, quickly leading the 8th floor upstairs. On the verge of being discovered, the 5th floor had no choice but to drag the 3rd floor into the 6th floor's room to hide. But the 6th floor wasn't about to let them have their way. He immediately screamed. Although quickly subdued, the noise reached the 8th floor. She rushed over and kicked the door open. Unexpectedly, the 4th floor, the parasite, emerged victorious. The 8th floor, the ruler, was overthrown once more. Initial freedom wasn't particularly moving, but the feeling of regaining what was lost was unforgettable. Everyone witnessed it all, sobbing and then embracing each other in joy. This was true liberation. The revolution was successful. The 6th floor, with his broken spine, couldn't move. The 8th floor was tied up on the ground with the dog. All the weapons were now in the hands of the lower floors. Seeing that all danger had been eliminated, this time, everyone was in agreement. They didn't mention ending the game, but instead discussed the previously mentioned floor swap. But before that, the 5th floor still had to seek revenge on the 6th. She wanted to castrate him, without anesthesia, without any painkillers. Only then could she swallow the resentment from his previous betrayal. After everything was settled, they finally discussed the main issue. As previously agreed, the 4th floor, having made the greatest contribution, would naturally enjoy the highest, the 8th floor. The 1st floor, the provider of information, would move to the 6th. Since the 7th floor was on their side, they naturally wouldn't touch him. Finally, under everyone's expectant gaze, the man on the 1st floor picked up his phone and, with a billion gu, purchased the room exchange item. He vanished into the transport elevator. When he reappeared, a letter lay where he had been. After reading its contents, the first-floor resident was stunned. It read, "As long as the program continues, you can use your prize money at any time to purchase and own a room. Refer to the price list below. Floor 1, 10 minutes per billion won. Floor 2, 20 minutes per billion won. Floor 3, 30 minutes per billion won. Floor 8, 340 billion won." At this point, everything became clear. There was a way to transcend class, but in reality, it was unattainable. In other words, their fates had been sealed from the beginning. All their efforts had been a joke, entertainment for the audience, merely a means to create more interesting spectacles. Everything seemed preordained. It was all a cruel game of cat and mouse orchestrated by the ruling class. With his long-held hope shattered, the first-floor man collapsed under the weight of this harsh reality. He wanted an end to it all. He grabbed a gun, threatening everyone, ordering them to freeze. They had to keep playing this game until he earned enough money to change his class. Seeing this, the 8th-floor resident laughed hysterically from where she lay. Even if these people tried their entire lives, they couldn't earn more than her. At that moment, the time in the lobby increased once more. The 8th-floor residents' laughter grew louder. Ignoring them, the first-floor man tied everyone to the chairs in the lobby. He then purchased numerous circus props and began working day and night, tirelessly constructing a magnificent stage. Late that night, the first-floor man's performance began. He intended to earn enough time to transcend his class through this spectacle. He stepped onto a tightrope. Everyone's hearts leaped into their throats. Just in time, he caught himself on the rope and carefully made his way to the other side. This heart-stopping feat immediately caused the time to jump. Seeing this, the first-floor man continued with an even more thrilling act. He walked to the center of the tightrope, without any safety measures, adjusted his posture, and began to jump in place. The clown tossed his only life into the air. He briefly touched the sky of the upper class. It seemed he had truly brushed against the boundaries of fate, experiencing a few seconds of free breath. But the price he paid was utter destruction. Like a moth drawn to a flame, he was completely consumed, reduced to ashes. After a moment of stunned silence, the others struggled to free themselves from their bonds. They quickly ripped off their clothes and rushed to put out the fire. He seemed to be on the verge of death. The second-floor resident rushed to the lobby door, but it wouldn't budge. The third-floor resident considered buying enough items to deplete the remaining time and end the game. But after the clown's performance, the time had reached an unprecedented high. Despair engulfed them all. This wasn't a money-making game. It was a prison of desire. Initially, they had been imprisoned by their own desires. Now, having discovered the truth of the game, it was too late. This time, the third-floor resident, who had always been patient, finally snapped. He grabbed the gun and fired repeatedly at the surveillance cameras in the lobby. If they were merely entertainment for the audience, then he would disrupt the game and deprive them of their spectacle. Furthermore, perhaps this was the way out of this prison. Seeing this, the second-floor resident rushed to help. The two of them followed the lobby staircase, systematically destroying every camera. Now, the audience could see nothing. There was no show left to amuse them. And indeed, this tactic had an unexpected effect. After the last camera was destroyed, the exit finally opened. But by then, the first-floor resident was on his last breath. All his life, he had yearned to climb higher, but a small figure like him should have known his place. He shouldn't have reached so high, for the higher the climb, the harder the fall. In his final moments, the first-floor man thought of his young daughter and apologized to everyone. Then, the third-floor resident stepped out the door. He wasn't greeted with flowers and applause, but with empty rows of seats in a theater and a letter placed at the front. It contained a single sentence stating that the prize money would soon be transferred to his account. Then, the curtain on the stage slowly opened, revealing the stark word "end." The third-floor resident finally returned home. The past 2 months felt like a dream, but the balance in his account was a constant reminder that it had all been real. The first-floor resident's death weighed heavily on everyone's conscience. In the end, they held a funeral for him. Due to life circumstances, the 6th-floor resident couldn't attend, sending a wreath instead. The 7th floor resident had already visited the 1st floor resident's family, giving them half of her prize money. The 8th floor resident's madness worsened. After leaving, she used an excavator to demolish the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Korea, in a single night. In the end, she not only lost all her prize money, but was also committed to a mental institution, free to indulge her madness. The game of 8, for now, had come to an end.